Fourthly, the regularity of our worship we see in the fourth commandment. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord God made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord has blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. 1 day in 7. 1 day in 7 belongs to God. This has to do with the balance of our work and our worship. Folks, why do we go to church every 7 days as opposed to every 40? And this is especially my question to those people who abandon the Reformed position and abandon the Ten Commandments as the Ten Commandments and abandon the fourth commandment because they would argue that you don't see it explicitly in the New Testament, in the New Covenant. Then my question to them is, why do we have church 1 day in 7 and not 1 day in 40? And would you discipline someone in your church who just showed up once a year? Would you allow them to still be members in your church? And if you discipline that person, you're basically saying they're committing a sin. Sin has to be tied to a moral obligation. How do you have a moral obligation without an ought, without a command? How do you do this? Our understanding of the Sabbath is one of the most critical junctures in our theology. Well, you get it from the law of Christ. Really? Tell me how the law of Christ gives you 1 day in 7 worship. How does it do? Well, you ought to want to go, Why ought you to want it? If it's not a moral imperative, why ought you to want it? Why would it be morally wrong for a Christian to say, I'm only going to show up 1 day a year? Why would it be morally wrong? Unless this is the moral law of God binding on all people for all times. 1 day in 7. 1 day in 7. Why would it be morally wrong for me to have servants or employees and to force my employees to work 7 days a week? Or would it be morally wrong? Because, by the way, if you throw out the fourth commandment, because the fourth commandment is not expressly repeated in the New Testament, by the way, it is. We'll talk about that when we get there, okay? But if you throw it out and become a 9-commandment person and you don't have the fourth commandment, then how do you justify having a moral obligation to treat your employees a certain way? Because whenever Paul or Peter talk about the treatment of servants, it is rooted and grounded in the morality of the fourth commandment. Which is another reason that I would argue that you do see it there in the New Covenant. But again, we're getting ahead of ourselves. But if you don't have this as a moral commandment, then you, again, it is not just that we worship 1 day in 7. It is not just that there's a day set apart as the Lord's day and not our own. It is also the idea that this affects and impacts the way we treat those people who work for us if we are employers. So we see the object of our worship, the limitations of our worship. We see the reverence of our worship and the regularity of our worship in the first 4 commandments. And I want you to notice how that first commandment is sort of an umbrella. God is God and God alone. Therefore, we worship God and only God, and we worship Him the way that He tells us to worship Him. Because God is God, we have reverence for His name. Because God is God, we have reverence for His day. You see how that's an umbrella.